In a meeting at the UN Security Council in February 2003, the U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, presented intelligence from satellite images as proof that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Though we now know that the information gathered from those images was wrong, the following month, the war on long-term occupation of Iraq began. And as my colleague Laura Kurgan has said, it was partly based on the idea of the infallibility of such an image and the technology that produced it. My research in the history of art and archaeology explores the history of the image, the practices of mimesis, and philosophies of representation. From the other side of history, in the distant past, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians understood that reality and representation were interdependent, and also that technologies of the image were among the technologies of war. Images and maps were also central to the success of the 19th century imperial colonial mission in the Middle East, in which archaeology participated. The topics I want to discuss in the context of this series of the humanities talks and methodologies have to do with the ways in which archaeology is at once implicated in and can read against and challenge the new technologies of power. I will begin with mapping. Some now speak of the militarization of archaeology as a discipline, its embeddedness within the aims of war and occupation, its new dependence on forms of remote sensing and geospatial mapping that, like aspects of warfare today, also involve experts who work remotely from distant computer screens. But since its earliest days, mapping has been one of the main activities of archaeologists and Orientalists in Iraq, which is ancient Mesopotamia. Though the militarization of archaeological practice is perhaps clearer now, as drones and digital technologies that were developed for the military, and some of them first used for reconnaissance and smart bombing in Iraq during the first Gulf War in 1991, are now commonly used by archaeologists. Like colonial-era cartography, these new technologies can provide great accuracy, but they also raise a number of questions about scopic regimes and formations of viewership. How are we to read this new scientific archaeological view from nowhere? What is the position of the viewer as subject? How does the image express its authority? And how does the aspect of temporality come into play within such images that are tagged geospatially and temporally? Art historians and historians of science have asked these kinds of questions in relation to earlier eras of imperialism. My work addresses how today, with archaeology's increasing reliance on declassified spy images such as CIA Corona satellites, remote sensing, and so on, we seem to be returning to the idea of the possibility of an unmediated representation. I am interested in ontologies of the image and of scientific images and the epistemological claims that they make, and also in how the subject position of archaeologists, to some extent, comes to be constructed by these images and is implicated in their forms of viewing and in the gazes that they generate. How does this new form of visual information and imaging develop for warfare, this exacting digital measurability of place or monument, erase its own representational apparatus? In the 19th century, Orientalist paintings were produced in a way as a way of knowing what was purported to be the reality of the exotic and decadent Orient. The paintedness of them was denied by means of the very processes of their painting, as the art historian Lyndon Auckland pointed out so brilliantly in 1983. The forms of exactitude without interpretation that military technologies have given archaeology also produce their own effects. The second related topic is collecting. Collecting antiquities involves the dislocation and disruption of object relations in assemblages and repositioning in forms of display. As such, colonial collecting practices are inscribed in techniques of power. This was not just a taking of symbolic capital of the antique that could be amassed in one place, like the movement of statues of the gods in antiquity, but it is directly related to landscapes and people. The removal of monuments and forced movements of populations often go hand in hand, so that Cyrus the Persian king's decree, which permitted displaced populations to return home in the 6th century BC, also included the restitution of statues. Looting of archaeological sites for the global antiquities market can now be tracked with satellite images so that we can see and document the devastation of the land for the illicit trade in heritage commodities. The techniques of power into which collecting is inscribed and participates in have to do with environments and with landscapes, but they also have to do with the writing of histories and the narratives that are told in museum displays and in texts. While coloniality was the condition that permitted both early archaeology and the 19th century collecting practices, which allowed the encyclopedic art museum to come into existence, a similar situation and condition is the context that permits both looting and the new archaeological technologies in Iraq. This brings me to the third aspect, which is narrating. All of these technologies, GIS mapping, remotely sensed data, and reliance on declassified military satellite images, are a means of representing and managing data, and so of narrating and display that involve the archaeological sciences. The writing out of the subject position of the observer in archaeological work then also impacts the writing of the historical account. Aerial imaging elevates the eye of the archaeologist so that archaeology is reconceptualized as a distance view, which in some ways is the direct opposite of traditional field work, but also involves the older methods of digging in the ground in areas that are pinpointed by that view. The view from above, remote sensing, and so on are also mediated by the technological military lens itself. Archaeologists have not given much thought to these aspects of their military technologies that were developed in some cases for targeting and smart bombing Iraq itself. On the other hand, several artists have been critically engaging with these new relations of spy satellites, drone imaging, warfare, and archaeology using technologies in reversed ways. And in our Columbia project, Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, we also turn away from standard methods. Rather, we are using these same new technologies to map a different kind of archaeological encounter, one that is phenomenologically tied to the landscape and which maps the multi-temporal historical relationships of living populations and monuments and ancient sites and antiquities that have been, in many cases, forcibly removed and appropriated for lucrative global markets in cultural heritage and for encyclopedic museums. We work in a transdisciplinary way. I've now started a new collaborative project with the Iraqi artist Hena Mailallah, tracing the links between colonialism and archaeology, repurposing technologies of power in a way that works more like bricolage, turning them to the service of exposing the destruction of war and colonial violence. To conclude, I would like to direct your view to a work of art. In a fascinating work by Hana Malallah, we see an encounter between a drone and an ancient Sumerian ziggurat temple tower. There you will see that the all-encompassing and masterful view of the drone is countered by the enduring and monumental force of the ancient ziggurat.